season starts here, the Vancouver Boat Show.
Welcome to the Vancouver International Boat Show virtual seminar series, sponsored by Freedom Marine International Yacht Sales, the premier choice for exploring the passion of yachting. Thank you for joining us. The seminar will begin in a minute. If you are having technical difficulties, you can reach me, the online moderator, via the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. Questions for our speaker can be added in the Q&A box, also at the bottom of your screen, and they will be answered after the slide presentation. It is our pleasure to present Preparing Your Boat for Offshore with Christof Marti. Over to you, Christof.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Welcome everybody on this afternoon. I don't know where you're joining from, but I guess for most of you it'll be afternoon. I'm gonna talk about the how to prepare for offshore sailing with a focus on the boat preparation. We will be touching on other aspects of preparing for offshore. And if you have questions, please ask them. In the end, we'll make sure that there's enough time so we can talk about topics that perhaps I don't touch on or you would like to have a little more information. With that quick overview, the beginning of the presentation will be on boat selection, boat preparation. I have a few thoughts on crew, as I assume most of you will not do it single-handed. A bit about practice, the short team, and in the end, as I mentioned, a Q&A session. The beginning of any offshore trip is the dream. We want to go somewhere, explore a beautiful place, perhaps more now than ever. And, you know, I look at this picture, this is in Maui, and that was always my dream, sail across the Pacific to Maui. You might have different goals, different destinations in mind, but I'm sure we all share that same dream of crossing an ocean. And I'll hope I can be able to get you a little bit closer to that dream if you're working on that. Boat selection. There is no right or wrong answer, really. Some of you will look at a traditional boat, others will look at a fancy fast boat, anywhere in between. Many people take a production cruising boat and prepare that to go across the ocean. And this is what this seminar is about. I'm going to talk a little bit about how would you take your boat and get it ready so you can cross an ocean safely. For us, we used a production boat. I've sailed on different boats, but that's the one we're currently sailing on. There is no right or wrong. One of the questions to ask yourself really is, what is it that you want your boat to do? Do you want to go in a race? Do you want to go cruise with your partner? Or you want to go with friends and family and cross an ocean? Where do you want to sail? More in the colder climates and warmer climates? What is it that you want your boat to do? That's a question you have to ask for yourself, and that will dictate a little bit what kind of boat you will end up with. Now, a few things that perhaps can guide you in doing so is think about sea berths. How many comfortable sea berths do you want so you can sleep comfortably when you're offshore? How much fuel, water do you want to bring? Storage for extended cruising is a big theme. It's different from coastal cruising. And these are things you cannot easily change. Now, the other things that you want to consider, obviously, cells and ever so more systems that we put on the boats, from communication to navigation to entertainment to domestic systems. All these things can easily be changed and upgraded given time and budget and some knowledge. So those are things to be considered when you're deciding on your boat. Now, we ended up sailing on this boat to Maui a few years ago. This is a Bennett the First 40.7. It's perhaps not, showing up on your list of top offshore cruising boats, but for us, it was a very versatile boat and well prepared that allowed us to cross the Pacific a couple times safely. Now, getting into the specifics of boat preparation, what you want to do is really look at your boat from the top of the mast all the way down to the keel and make sure that you have a well-prepared boat. And one of the things to do is that I always sort of emphasis is to really take that preparation seriously. I feel, and I'm convinced of that about 80% of a successful ocean passage is in the preparation of the boat and the crew. It's not an endeavor that you want to take lightly, because one of the things we want to emphasize on is once you're offshore, you want to be self-reliant. You have to be self-reliant, because one of the things is you're going to maybe be 1,000 miles away from shore, and you can't just go down to the next marine store or call the next marine technician to help you with whatever problem you may have. So it is really important to prepare, much like, you go on a hiking trip up in a mountain or a cross-country skiing, backcountry skiing. You want to be prepared when you're out there in the elements. You want to be prepared when you're out there and stuff fails, or you have to maybe deviate and do different destinations due to weather or other circumstances. Next thing, we'll talk about these topics a bit of a timelines. So one of the questions that always comes up, how long does it take to prepare a boat for offshore? I'm going to talk about some tools such as checklists and priorities that will help you guide along this journey of preparing a boat. We'll talk some about the big ticket items that you might want to consider. And then a small line at the bottom, you don't want to forget your routine maintenance. I'll give you an example. We sailed to Maui one day on a boat, and once we were in Maui, we had problems with our engine cooling system, and we realized that our impeller failed, and we had to admit to ourselves that impeller had something like 500 hours on it, and why we didn't change it before we left, we don't know. We missed it. But that's what I mean by routine maintenance. You focus on all these big things to go offshore, and then you forget that your alternator belt or your raw water pump impeller is way past its regular replacement date. The question comes, how long do I have to prepare in advance? And, people like numbers. I would say 1 to 2 years. Don't, hold me to that. It depends on the boat, your experience. Maybe you have a boat that sailed across the ocean before. Maybe your boat is a production boat that comes right off the factory and you have to prepare everything from scratch. Allow for delays. There is always going to be unexpected that pops up while you're preparing for the boat, whether that's a technical problem, whether that's something in your personal life, work life that comes up, or perhaps a spare part that you can't get in time. Allow for some sea trials. You don't want to prepare a boat and then your first passage is from here to Hawaii or across the Atlantic. Take your boat out and plan for some serious sailing on it so you can test these systems in real life. One of the things I find here is very nice to do is you sail around Vancouver Island. That's probably as good as a sea trial you can get to prepare for offshore. Book call-outs and service companies early. Right now, apparently boating is really, really popular. I talk to the guys in the marine. I talk to companies that sell boats, and they're all busy. I tried to book a hole-out for a friend who is currently overseas, and they're looking 3 to 4 months waiting times. They're booking for June. So book these things early, both with the yard, the service company. One of the things that helps with that, you put together a high-level schedule and put in milestones, when you want to leave, when you want your haul out, when you want to have your crew committed. And then based on that, you put together a detailed work plan and a training schedule. And that you can communicate with your crew, with your family, with your team that you sail with, and everybody can make time in their schedule because, as you know, everybody's busy. everybody has their schedule full. And if you show up 2 weeks before and you want your team to help with a day's work in the boatyard, they probably already have scheduled other stuff. One of the tools that I really used a lot, and I highly suggest is in your boat preparation, is the use of checklists. You want to have checklists to help with preparation, otherwise you'll forget stuff. And not just checklists for your boat, but also for administrative stuff. What do I mean? If you're entering a race, there's a lot of administrative work and submittals and paperwork you have to submit. If you're going cruising, how about your entry permits, your cruising permits, passports, and all these things you have to think about, sort it out in advance. The lists, these checklists are always long, and you will never be able to just finish everything on these checklists. So having priorities and make sure that the high important priorities are addressed first, and then maybe the sort of nice to do items are perhaps looked at a little bit later down the road. And what I highly suggest is assign crew to certain tasks. It does two things. It takes time or takes a load away from your schedule, and it familiarizes the crew with the tasks, with the boat, of the different systems that you're going to be looking at. So it depends also a bit on you. If you're retired and all you do is preparing your boat for offshore, then perhaps you can do much more on your own. If you have a busy work life and juggling work, family, and trying to get a boat ready to offshore sailing, perhaps you need more people helping you with that. Now, it's quite a task to get offshore, and a lot of people ask, so where do I start? How do I even know where to begin with? And here is just a few thoughts. Most of you might start out talking to a few fellow sailors, talking clubs, join the Offshore Cruising Association, or talk to other people that have done this. If you're looking for more official information and guidance, the offshore special regulations are a really good point. Even if you're not intending to race, it's got a lot of experience from around the world of people sailing across the oceans that are putting together in checklists and tell you how to prepare your boat, anywhere from your hull design to rescue systems, to communication systems, to medical things. So it's a really good resource. If you decide to go in a cruising rally, they often provide checklists, or here locally, one of the areas I always point to is the Vic-Maui race. They've got a great resource online. You have a checklist that helps you as a starting point to go through what you need to do to prepare your boat for offshore sailing. Now, I'm going to move a little more specific to systems. One of the things I like to think of is I look at my boat and try to divide it in different systems. You can think about yourself a bit. What sort of system do you think you have on a boat? One, obviously, is a hull. We got a hull that needs to be watertight, needs to be structurally sound. We got an engine we need for propulsion. We need to generate electricity. We have a rig, we have sails. But then we also got a whole bunch of other systems on communications, navigation, domestic systems, plumbing systems. So thinking in these systems will help you to focus on certain tasks and certain preparations. And this is a recurring theme. We'll hear that again throughout the presentation. What do I mean by thinking systems? One of the systems I like to address is the steering system. Quite often, we just talk about the rudder. The rudder got to work, and if the rudder falls off, we're in trouble. And that's true. Well, funny enough, the few incidents I know where people had problems with the rudder wasn't necessarily the rudder that was the issue. The rudder was just fine, but the turning blocks for the steering cables came loose. They were not properly secured, or the quadrant was old and had a crack and failed. So the way I'd like to look at it is look at your steering system as a rudder post. You got bearings. Understand your bearings without getting into technical details here, but there are different bearings, and some are more susceptible to damage than others. Some need more regular maintenance than others. So understanding what kind of bearings you have, maintain them if required, is key for a rudder to be working properly. Understand your quadrant, have a look at it. Your autopilot, is it connected to the quadrant? Does it have a separate steering mechanism going on to the rudder? The autopilot, and finally the emergency steering. How are you going to integrate that in your boat should your primary steering system fail? So I use this system extensively, because it's an important system that often doesn't get the attention it should get, while we're spending more time on the entertainment system and on the border or on the color of the interior finishing. And B, because it shows what I mean by talking about systems rather than just pointing at the rudder and pointing at the rig as such. Another example is the inner forestay. Quite often people say, well, I want an inner forestay because they heard it might help having an inner staysail put up, or maybe even just to have both sails up. It's a very common feature on offshore boats. So people that I have a boat without an inner forestay, well, so well, maybe I want to put one on. And it's more than just putting a stay on. You have to attach it to the mast. You have to attach it to the hull. What material you're going to use? How are you going to attach your sails? You might need jack stays, because where you attach your inner forestay to the mast, it's perhaps not where the mast is designed to take loads. Test your system. I'm aware of, or very familiar actually, of a system where somebody put an inner forestay on, and sadly the screws were penetrating the mast much too much. And so when they went sailing, it chafed through their halyards constantly. Their other halyards broke all the time. So if that happened, you got to test the system. Then you find out, rather than going halfway across the ocean, to realize there's something wrong, and now it's hard to fix while you're offshore. Some other big ticket items. A rig inspection. Quite often nowadays, even insurance will ask you to have a rig inspected before they allow you to go offshore. I mean, think about the boat you're on. Is it a new boat? Is the rig, a few years old? Or are you buying, or have you already bought a more traditional boat that's maybe built in the 70s and 80s, and the rig has never been replaced? So that is a big task. You might have to remove the mast. What comes with that? Now you got to schedule this. It's one of the items that will take more of your time than you perhaps think of. Emergency steering system. We talked a bit about the steering system, but what if your rudder breaks off by hitting something? What if your steering cables break? So think about that, and that is often a fairly big deal, because your boat is not designed typically to take on an emergency steering system. Some people might put on a wind vane combined with an emergency steering system. Some people will have custom-made brackets and things like that. And those things, again, you can't just put that on a month before you go sailing offshore. It will take a little more time to do that and to test the system. Does it work? Water maker. Nowadays, a lot of offshore boats do have water makers. If you have a boat that needs this installed, that's a major installation. Plan that in advance, plan that early. Then you're not dealing with this last minute. Sails, long lead times. You might want to buy a few extra sails, perhaps a drifter, perhaps a storm sail, perhaps you need an extra genoa or chip. All these things, they take time, and don't want to order this last minute. Now, we talked about all this big stuff, but it's the small stuff. As we say, the devil is in the details. I give you an example. We had a plan of putting all our sort of spare provisions into bins and put them on the settees in the main cabin, and then put the lead cloths up. But sort of a few weeks before we left, you realize it's not really secure. These bins slide around. If you were to be knocked over, they would just come flying through the cabin. So last minute, we had to come up with how do we secure that? And there's a bunch of little things like that. Where do you store your crew gear? Are you having 4 or 5 people on the boat and everybody brings their foul weather gear? Where do you hang that? How do you store it? If you're offshore for 2-3 weeks, where do you put your provisions? How do you put that away, and how do you get easy access? Lockers and floorboard, they're not designed for the rigor of offshore sailing on a traditional or on a production boat necessarily. So how can you secure your floorboards? How do you secure your lockers? Leak cloth so you can sleep comfortably. All these things take time and have to think them through. I share a few little pictures here of small things we've done. Everybody wants a water bottle, and we have these water bottles, and they're in the cockpit on the floor, and they're in the galley and the sink, so they're always in the way. So we decided, for instance, to buy a standard set of water bottles. Everybody gets the same bottle, put the name on it. And then we had these custom-made mesh packs that we put in the cabins and in the cockpit. When people were in those rooms, they could safely store these. And it's a little thing, but it made a heck of a difference to having an organized, clean cockpit instead of tripping over water bottles like we did before. If you're racing, you have a ton of cells. How do you store these cells? Down on the right, the crew gear. How do you store that? This was our system. It's also one of the systems that people complained. So we got to rethink that a little bit, and I would agree looking at this picture. Offshore sailing is a team event. It's something that you typically do as a team. It might be a 2-person team. It might be a bigger team. It might be an 8 or 12 people race team. But in any event, typically people do this together. And I highly recommend to delegate some of that work. Otherwise, you might get overwhelmed. Plus, what it does, the whole delegation of some work, it also helps the team building a little bit. And we'll talk more about the crew in a minute. Now, I had a topic that perhaps is not too favorite, but people always ask about it, is what about damage? And just think to yourself a minute, what do you think is the stuff that typically breaks when you go offshore? And here is a little summary of things that they found in the aircraft. That's a rally across the Atlantic to the Caribbean from Europe. Sails is one of the items that breaks a lot, so you want to prepare for that. Sail repair kit, spare sails. Chafe would be very high on my list as well. It's a difference when you're sailing for 2-3 hours a day or 24 hours non-stop. Everywhere you got lines going that might chafe, and you might find points that you haven't thought about before, and chafe will wear through sails and rigging very, very quickly. Rigging problems, again, it typically stems from the fact that people don't pay enough attention, have the rig inspected, and do the work that's required. Steering problems, I talked enough about that, and then some other stuff. They had in that particular race 2 props falling off, and well, that sounds incredible. It actually happened to me as well at some point. And so here are some personal things. I don't seem to have a lucky hand with an alternator, so 3 times out of the passages I did, I had alternator issues. So I carry a spare alternator on the boat. We had chafe, we had some sail damage, we had a prop falling off. And so this is sort of the stuff that you want to have in the back of your mind when you're preparing your boat and you're preparing for the damage. And again, I'll think in different systems. What systems can fail, and then prepare for that. And the key is, think about what would you do if certain things fell? What if my raw water pump fails on the engine? What if my Genoa fails? What if I have a problem with plumbing or electrical systems on the boat that I like to fix? And maybe at the bottom, the big, I should have put that in big red letters, is be self-sufficient. Splicing as a keyword here, with these new lines, those Spectrum Dyneema lines you might have heard of, you can fabricate a heck of a lot of stuff yourself and fixing rigging problems and having things attached. So you want to become a MacGyver. You want to be able to fix stuff yourself. One of the things I do, obviously you need the proper spare and tools. And I'm big on organizing these things, and going back to thinking into systems, I organize all these spare parts according to the systems. So I'll have my engine bin with filters and impellers, and I got my rigging bins, and then I note exactly what goes in these bins and what do I have. Maybe if I have a part number, I list this, and I make a note where on the boat is that bin's located. Because perhaps you're asleep when the bin is needed, or perhaps you're incapacitated and you want your crew to be able to find these things, and they can just look at these lists and know where stuff is without relying on you. Here is your MacGyver results. So we had a rigging failure, boom bang broke on us, and we put together some shackles and loops and with some parts on the rigging bin, and built our own boom bang back together, and it worked and kept the boom under control. So that's what I mean by, you have to be able to have the tools and be your own MacGyver. There is a lot of associations and areas you can get information from. Here are some thoughts on that. You might have other ideas. Books, there's tons of books. Here are some of the favorite books I have and some of the references I made. You'll find a lot of these things, and reading is really good, because I'm telling you just a small little bit about this, and you hear a lot of different ideas. Here's some books that I highly recommend to look into, and then perhaps have other people that have a lot of experience and done a lot of ocean passages telling you what their experiences, what their tips are for offshore sailing. Crew. I just put 3 words down here, and I think that's really important. At 2 o'clock in the morning, when you're tired and cold, your personalities come through, and you want to make sure that at that time when things getting perhaps a little bit rough, or people are a little bit on edge because they're tired, or because a heavy weather front is approaching, that they're reliable, that their personalities are such that you're compatible amongst yourselves. And really important is enthusiasm. It's a long journey. Offshore sailing is not a sprint, it's a marathon, it's a triathlon maybe. And that little bit of enthusiasm, both in preparing the boat and getting ready and getting over the start line and offshore, really carries a long way to keep everybody happy while you're out there. I've mentioned this a couple of times now, delegate some of the work to the crew. And here is one way that perhaps is a way to look at it. Again, to keep with the theme of organizing stuff into system, I looked at certain areas. Safety is high on the list, navigation, weather, medical. And then I delegate and have a systems champion for that system. And they're then delving a little more into that particular topic and familiarize themselves with the system. And it does a few things. One, it takes the load off you as a skipper. B, it also is a backup, because now you have another person that's intimately familiar with a system. So should you be tired or need to rest, or should you be out of commission for some reason as a skipper, then you have another person on your team that knows how to change the impeller on the engine, or knows how to change the filters on the water maker. And the other thing it does, it brings you together as a team. It's a really good team building event. And, there's not a complete list, and I'm not saying this is the correct list, but as a thought, the systems champions is something that I started sort of a little late in the game, and it's something that I think is worth the effort to expand on a little bit more. Training, I'm not going to talk at length at this, but I thought, despite this being about boat preparation, I want to bring this up. I think it's important to think about training, just like if anything else you do. training takes different forms. Some is, of course, you're going to go sail and understand your boat and practice for your sailing, your emergencies, maybe know how to install your emergency rigger actually not just on the dock, but while you're on the ocean. Learn the systems and procedures at the dock. You don't need to just leave the dock, but you can learn a lot by just being on the boat and looking at the different systems while you're at the dock. And then off the water, there is first aid training, learn about weather, navigation, survival at sea. There is another seminar tomorrow, I believe, on safety at sea. Highly recommend that. As David Sutcliffe will talk about that, very experienced sailor. So how to prepare for when things go really wrong and to have a plan. So that's a good seminar to join. First aid, you can perhaps call a doctor, but perhaps not, and you need to be able to fix whatever happens to people or crew on the boat yourself. Just some pictures, go out practicing, top left, put your storm cells up. You have storm cells, put them up and see how they work. Survival training, know how to board a life raft, know what's in your life raft, understand how your life raft works. Practice with your navigational equipment. It's getting more complicated with computer and weather routing software. So there's all things that you want to learn before you cast off your bow lines. Here, a small slide, a small topic perhaps, but still worth thinking about. I talked to somebody the other day or a few weeks ago and asked me, so what's the short team for other than cheering you on? I said, that's a really important point to be cheered on. But depending on what kind of sailing you do, I always had a backup on shore, and they were looking at the weather. They had more resources, so they could give me tips on weather routing. They could tell me where perhaps to go. They were rested. They probably look at it with a fresher mind than I'm looking at it being tired on the boat. Medical. We had somebody on shore, a doctor, that knew the medical history of everybody on the boat. So when problem came up, we could call that person and they would liaise with the onshore doctors. It's a backup when things go wrong and you need to call somebody and find out, how does this work, or perhaps get some tips on technical things you can deal with. And social, a lot of people now share their sailing stories on social media, and perhaps you have a social media coordinator that does that for you. This depends a bit. If you're cruising, you can do whatever you want. If you're racing, there's probably some restrictions in shore support, and maybe you can't have all that, but things to think about. The other thing they do, they help with preparation, shopping, perhaps meal planning, all these things that are not directly related to a boat, but they're crucial to have a good open ocean passage. Provisions, something to think about. The range is huge. Some people, they stick 100 cans of tuna on the boat and off they go, and others, they want gourmet meals. Bread making, fishing. One of the things I want to just point out is an installation, because it directly goes into your boat preparation. We had a crew that wanted really nice meals, and so we brought a lot of meals that were prepared in advance. We obviously didn't have enough freezer space. So what we did, we installed one of those external freezers. This was bolted down and it couldn't move, so it was safe. But we had to bring power to that. We had to figure out where it goes so it doesn't affect the operation of the boat. So it's, again, one of these things to think about. How do you want to provision your boat? Are you okay with a sack of rice and tuna, or do you want to go a little more sophisticated, or are you one of those self-reliant, you just want to rely on fishing, which, by the way, is fun, but you don't want to just rely on fishing, because at least if you were on my boat, you would probably starve, because I wasn't that lucky with it. Here, just a few slides before we get into Q&A. It's not directly related, but perhaps just some little slides on this. Few pictures. Enjoy life at sea. Sometimes it's rough and sometimes it's just wonderful. Looking back, here's some thoughts. I'm not going to just read them to you. You can look at those. This is sort of a summary of what I look at in preparing the boat. Now, with that, I think I'll open up to questions. So I don't know if I asked the host if there was question, or the moderator, if there's questions being submitted, then please let me know. And if not, I do have a few more thoughts to share.
Okay, so yeah, feel free, everyone, to put any questions you have in the Q&A box. And if we just give them a minute here.
Is one of the questions that often comes up is how much does it cost to prepare a boat? And I don't have a very good answer, but I can give you some thoughts on it. One is it's going to be more than you expect. It's always more than you expect if you own a boat, you know that. But if I had to throw out a number, I prepared our boat, and now we did include a few extra cells that if you're cruising that perhaps you don't need. But based on these numbers, we had a well-funded boat that has crossed an ocean before, and we probably spent about $50,000 in preparing that boat, including all the cost stuff, you know, provisions and fuel and fees that had to be paid. But I think any sort of preparing a boat, you're looking at some significant cost. And depending on where you're starting, if this could be less or it could be a little bit more. But I thought that was a good number to at least start from.
Okay, so we do have some questions here for you.
Okay.
From Kevin. One of the things I stress with my crew is that they need to bring things to keep themselves entertained, as well as things to share with the rest of the crew. Ocean crossings can be a bit boring. I don't know if you have a view on that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I am my own thing is I look at it as nice to not having stuff to do at times. Well, life is too busy as it is, and offshore, I just enjoy not having to do much at times. Having said that, I found there was always something to do, whether it is keeping up with some maintenance, preparing a meal, and whenever I had some extra time, I just cook bread or do something like that. But at the same time, you know, a lot of people like to just bring a book to read, music, share music. I think it's just one of the things that you want to talk with your crew about, and it's one of the things you probably want to be on the same page. What you do, how you, like we always had a fun time listening to different people's music on the boat, it's an important aspect. Absolutely.
Okay, we have a question from Charlotte. What to do if you discover a crew doesn't work out well at sea?
Very good point. I have experience with that, and it's challenging. It's very challenging. It depends a little bit what you mean by it doesn't work out. Are they just afraid? Are they being disruptive to the team? Are they actually a danger to the team? So depending a little bit on how they don't fit with the team, you might have different approach. But one of the things for sure, as a skipper, you want to talk with them. Perhaps you have another person on the crew, like we had when we called it our bosun. So it was sort of the person that was feeling out the crew, and when there was tension or so, he was the person, not actually me as a skipper, who would talk to the crew. But definitely the minute you realize something is not working, you got to seek the dialogue, because it's not going to get better on its own, and it's important to address that.
Okay, I think that's it for questions for now. Just give people another minute if they do have a question to pop it in to the Q&A box. Did you have any other thoughts that you wanted to share with everyone?
Yeah, one of the things I just share one of my mistakes. I looked at the boat. I sailed on a passage. I wasn't the owner of the boat or the skipper, but I was part of the preparing it. And how many miles a day do you cover? And I think we tend to overestimate how much we do, because we say, well, the boat does on average 7-8 knots or so, and then we multiply that by 4 and come up with a number. And I don't want to throw out numbers here because there's so many different types of boats, it wouldn't make sense. But the one message I definitely would like to give is be conservative when it comes down to estimating how long it will take to do a passage. Maybe you have a technical problem that slows you down. And the reason why I say that is not for the people who have endless time and doesn't really care whether they show up a week early or later. But quite often people have lives outside of that adventure and they need to catch a flight. Now they're building some float and so forth. But it's also down to you as the skipper and operator of the boat to perhaps build in some float in your trip in itself and be conservative on how long you think it takes to cross an ocean.
Okay, well, we have a couple more questions in. Ken is asking, what were your communication systems at sea?
Very good question. And they change, they evolve. What we had is we had 2 independent satellite communication systems. Now, we traditionally, I was also on boats where we had now I can't say the word, but the old ham radio, and I think that's evolving a bit. The other thing that we had as a backup was one of those smaller devices, Iridium messaging devices, such as InReach you might have heard, or other things like that. So with the 2 independent satellite systems, one was routed through a computer and one was just a sat phone. And we covered everything from weather, emails, sending out clips, and emergency communications. And then as an absolute backup, we had this InReach handheld, which is absolutely invaluable because it gives you position, it gives you communication, and it's very inexpensive and it's very reliable.
Okay. Bruce asks, any thoughts on a personal checklist? What do I need to know / experience before I start thinking about heading offshore on my own boat?
Checklist in the sense of personal experience. I think there's no right answer here. There's people that headed offshore and they got to Cape Horn and they literally had to call and find out where the heck they ended up. And there's people that spent 10 years of their life for the first trip. Personally, I think, what I tell my crew, for instance, is you have to spend some time in a boat, and not just weekend cruising, but spend some time in a boat cruising, even if it's just locally at the marina every day. So what does it mean to live on a boat for a week or 2? And then you expand that, maybe throw in a couple offshore passages where you're just 50 miles off Vancouver Island. That's as far as your regular insurance will carry you. And you can spend a night or 2 at sea and get a feel for it and test your systems. So there is really no right answer. Maybe you get some experienced crew that comes with you. Maybe you're as a skipper are not the most experienced. And I've done that. I've went with people that had no or little experience. And so bringing an experienced friend or colleague along, some people hire skippers. Now that is another way to go. You hire a professional that comes along with you. So a lot of different ideas around that, and there's no really good answer. This is what your curriculum should look like. But I do suggest some training, some safety at sea training, some experience with fixing your boat yourself, and some miles under the keel, so you're not just completely new when you're heading offshore.
Okay. Dawn says, thank you for a great presentation, speaking as an experienced offshore crew member. And he also asked, how did you get your weather information?
So we used, we got the technical side of things. We had an Iridium Go, which is basically a satellite modem that speaks to the Iridium network. And then we had software that put it into our computer, where we used the weather routing program that interpreted this weather for giving us best route informations. But that worked really well with the Redeem Go. And there are countless other options to get you weather, but I find that the satellite communication is so good now that you can get really good weather data that you can then download, import, and to use on whatever software you choose to look at this weather data.
Hey, Don also asked, did you use Predict Wind?
We didn't, simple because Predict Wind is a paid service, and for the racing we did, we're not allowed to have paid service. I've used Predict Wind personally, and I like it. And in fact, a lot of software such as Expedition, it comes with that interface with Predict Wind. So certainly it's a very well-known application for getting weather and including getting weather routing information through that system.
Okay, Dan asks, do you use a type of media server? For example, I've heard some cruisers are using Raspberry Pi as a media server, and so crew can more easily share info like OpenCPN for navigation.
I'm not familiar with that. I'm familiar with OpenCPN. Have not used it. I've looked at it on the laptop at home, but I've never used it on a boat. I've heard good things about it, but unfortunately, I have to defer to more technical savvy people. I'm not sort of at the forefront probably of the latest, the greatest communication apps that are out there.
Okay. I believe that's it for the questions. If you want to close out with any comments. Great presentation, Christof. So impressed with what you've accomplished over the years.
Thank you very much. No, thanks you all for joining. This is a different format for all of us. I do miss the direct person-to-person interaction, but this is what we got, and I'm glad that you managed to make it. And I encourage you, if you have anything that I didn't touch on, feel free to send me an email. It's on the screen here, and I'm happy to answer that. And I do wish all of you that have plans to go offshore that the borders are opening before too long, and that you're going to have a safe and excellent dream experience in sailing across the ocean on your boat or crew for somebody else before too long.
Okay, thank you.
You can practice locally and sail around Vancouver Island, which is a wonderful way to prepare your boat. So
nice. Well, thank you, Christof, and thank you for joining us today. We are interested in your feedback, either on this seminar or if you have ideas on topics that you would like us to cover in the future. Simply click on the Evaluate tab located just above the seminar description and complete the form. After the show, all attendees will also receive a post-show survey. Be sure to check out all of the features at the Vancouver International Boat Show Virtual. If you have a question, you can check out our info booth. Have a great time at the boat show. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, the season starts here, the Vancouver Boat Show.